It all started on a humid summer afternoon at a crowded bus stop. The air was thick with heat, the kind that clings to your skin and makes the world feel slower. Among the crowd stood an older man, his posture upright but his face shadowed by years of quiet endurance. He clutched a small, well-worn duffel bag, his only companion for the day. Around him, people shuffled impatiently, but he stood still, gazing at the horizon as if he had learned to wait for things far more important than buses. The screech of a police cruiser disrupted the hum of the city. Heads turned as a young officer, sharp in his uniform, stepped out, exuding the kind of authority that makes people instinctively stiffen. His eyes scanned the crowd, locking onto the man. For a moment, there was no sound but the faint chatter of passers-by. Then, with deliberate steps, the officer moved toward him, his voice slicing through the air. "You. What are you doing here?" The question was laced with accusation, not curiosity. The man turned slowly, meeting the officer's gaze without flinching. "Waiting for the bus, same as everyone else," he said evenly, his voice calm but firm. But that wasn't enough. The officer's eyes narrowed, a smirk creeping across his face, and he tilted his head toward the bag. "That yours? Mind if I take a look?" The man hesitated, his grip tightening on the strap. "It's just my things." "There's no need." "Is that so?" The officer's tone was mocking now, loud enough for the gathering crowd to hear. "If you've got nothing to hide, why don't you let me decide that?" The man didn't move. "With all due respect, officer, I don't consent to searches without cause." That was all it took. The officer's smirk vanished, replaced by a glint of anger. "'Cause," he spat. "You think I need cause to do my job?" Without waiting for an answer, he reached for the bag, jerking it from the man's grasp. The contents spilled out, an old jacket, a dog-eared book, a canteen, scattered across the pavement like a cruel display. Murmurs rippled through the crowd, but no one stepped forward. The man knelt to collect his belongings, his hands steady despite the humiliation. The officer leaned in closer, his voice low but biting. "People like you think you're untouchable. Let me remind you, you're not." The man rose, his eyes burning with restrained fury. "I don't know what kind of man you think I am, but you're wrong." The officer laughed, a sharp, cold sound. "I know exactly who you are. A nobody." And then, as if to punctuate his words, the officer's foot shot out, connecting with the man's shin, a swift, deliberate act of cruelty. The crowd gasped, but still, no one moved. The man stumbled but didn't fall. Instead, he straightened, his face unreadable except for the flicker of something fierce and unyielding. "What the hell are you gonna do about it?" the officer sneered, but his words hung in the air like a challenge he didn't fully understand. The man's voice was steady, but there was a new edge to it, sharp and unrelenting. "You've made a mistake." The officer scoffed, his confidence unshaken. "Is that so?" The man stepped closer, his stature suddenly commanding, the years of patience and silence melting away to reveal something the officer hadn't anticipated: experience. Authority. Strength. "You don't know who I am, but you're about to find out." The officer faltered for a split second, but he recovered quickly, masking it with bravado. "Yeah. Let's see you try." The man didn't respond. Instead, he fixed the officer with a look that silenced the entire street. The kind of look that carried the weight of battles fought and won, not just on the streets but on far harsher grounds. He didn't have to say more. The air between them crackled with unspoken tension, and for the first time, the officer seemed to realize he might be out of his depth. What happened next shocked everyone. A confrontation unlike anything they had ever seen, a clash of two lives, one steeped in privilege and arrogance, the other forged in struggle and resilience. It was more than a fight, it was a reckoning. And by the time it was over, the officer would face consequences he never imagined. But how did it unfold? What secrets did this man carry that could shake the very foundation of the officer's certainty? And why would the fallout leave an entire city questioning its values? Stay with us as we unravel this gripping tale of injustice, strength, and the ultimate reckoning. The answer to those questions will leave you stunned. Don't miss it. At Plow of Twist, we stand firmly against any form of racism or discrimination. To our Black audience and allies, we want to remind you that your voices, stories, and experiences matter deeply. This channel is a safe space where justice, equality, and empowerment are celebrated. Now, settle in for an emotional and powerful story that reveals the strength of resilience and the ultimate reckoning of justice. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel and hit that like button to support our message. Enjoy the story. The late afternoon sun burned down on the bus stop, where a crowd of commuters waited impatiently, their faces glistening with sweat in the heavy, stagnant air. Among them stood Earl Patterson, a man who carried the weight of a life marked by quiet battles and unspoken resilience. Earl was in his late 60s, with a lean frame that belied the strength still hidden beneath years of hard labor and discipline. His dark skin, etched with lines of experience, spoke of a lifetime that had known both struggle and triumph. His posture was upright, almost defiant, yet his expression was calm, as though the world's injustices had long since ceased to surprise him. Earl had a routine. Every Wednesday, he made his way across town to visit his granddaughter. It was his favorite day of the week, a chance to escape the isolation of his modest apartment on the outskirts of the city. In his hand, he carried a worn duffel bag, filled with little gifts for her, a used puzzle he had found at a thrift store, a pack of her favorite candy, and a small notebook he thought she might use for her drawings. For Earl, these simple trips represented the last vestiges of his pride, a reminder that he still had a purpose, even in a world that often seemed eager to erase men like him. The bus stop, however, was not a place of comfort. It was a liminal space where people stood together yet remained apart, avoiding eye contact and clutching their belongings tightly. Earl often felt the subtle stares, the unspoken assumptions. To many, he was just another old man, worn down by life and easily dismissed. But Earl didn't mind. He had learned to navigate these moments with quiet dignity, letting the whispers and stares roll off him like water off stone. As the minutes dragged on, a police cruiser pulled up to the curb, its flashing lights cutting through the afternoon haze. The appearance of the car was an intrusion, its presence turning the mundane scene at the bus stop into something tense and charged. Out of the car stepped Officer Daniel Crawley, a man in his early 30s with sharp features and an air of self-assured authority. Daniel's uniform was crisp, his badge gleaming in the sunlight. He was the kind of man who wore his position like armor, a shield against any challenge to his sense of control. Daniel had grown up in the suburbs, far removed from the struggles that marked Earl's life. He had entered the police academy straight out of high school, driven by a desire for structure and power. Over the years, he had developed a reputation for being aggressive, especially when dealing with the city's poorer neighborhoods. To Daniel, authority was a tool to be wielded, and respect was something to be demanded, not earned. As he scanned the group of people at the bus stop, his gaze locked onto Earl. There was something about the older man that seemed to irk him, a quiet defiance in his stance, a refusal to shrink under the weight of authority. Daniel's jaw tightened as he approached, his footsteps deliberate and loud against the pavement. Earl noticed the officer's approach but didn't move. He had encountered men like Daniel before, men who mistook uniforms for character, who wielded power like a weapon. As Daniel stopped in front of him, Earl met his gaze, his expression neutral but unwavering. "Excuse me," Daniel said, his voice sharp. "What's in the bag?" Earl raised an eyebrow, his grip on the duffel bag tightening slightly. "Just my things," he replied, his tone measured. "Is there a problem?" Daniel smirked, his eyes narrowing. "There might be. Why don't you hand it over, and we'll see." Around them, the crowd grew still, their murmurs fading into uneasy silence. Earl's heart began to race, but he kept his face calm. I'm not sure what you're looking for, officer, but there's nothing illegal here. Daniel took a step closer, his posture towering over Earl's. I didn't ask if it was illegal. Hand it over, or I'll make it a problem. Earl hesitated, his mind racing. He had every right to refuse, but he knew how easily these situations could spiral out of control. Still, there was a part of him, a part that had endured so much over the years, that refused to bow to intimidation. With all due respect, I don't think you have a reason to search my bag, he said, his voice firm. The tension in the air was palpable, the crowd frozen as they watched the exchange. Daniel's smirk faded, replaced by a flash of anger. Without warning, he grabbed the bag from Earl's hands, the force of the motion causing its contents to spill onto the ground. The sound of objects hitting the pavement echoed in the stillness, drawing gasps from the onlookers. Earl bent down to collect his belongings, his hands steady despite the humiliation. But as he reached for his notebook, Daniel's boot came down, pinning it to the ground. Earl looked up, his eyes burning with restrained fury. Was that necessary? He asked, his voice low. Daniel leaned in, his voice dripping with condescension. People like you always think you can talk back. Let this be a lesson, you don't get to decide how this goes. The crowd began to murmur again, some shifting uncomfortably, others pulling out their phones to record the scene. Earl straightened, meeting Daniel's gaze with a steady resolve. You don't know who you're talking to, he said quietly, his voice carrying an edge that made even Daniel pause for a moment. But the officer quickly recovered, his smirk returning. I know exactly who you are, he said. A nobody. The words hung in the air, sharp and cutting, and for the first time, Earl's composure cracked. His jaw tightened, his fists clenching at his sides. He had spent a lifetime enduring moments like this, but something about this encounter felt different. This wasn't just about him, it was about everything he had fought for, everything he had endured. And he wasn't going to let it end here. As Daniel turned to leave, satisfied with his display of power, Earl's voice stopped him in his tracks. You think this is over, he said, his tone calm but laced with an unshakable certainty. It's not. The officer froze, his smirk faltering as he turned back to face the older man. There was something in Earl's eyes now, something unyielding, something that spoke of battles fought and won long before Daniel had ever put on a badge. For the first time, Daniel felt a flicker of doubt, a sense that he might have underestimated the man standing before him. And as the bus pulled up to the curb, its brakes screeching loudly, the crowd began to disperse, their eyes lingering on the two men locked in a silent standoff. No one knew what would happen next, but one thing was certain, this was far from over. The bus stop faded into the distance as Earl walked away, his step steady but his mind racing. The scene had left a sour taste in his mouth, not because it was unfamiliar, but because it was far too familiar. Earl had learned long ago how to carry himself in a world that often sought to undermine him. But this time, something gnawed at him, a sense of injustice that refused to be buried. As he made his way down the cracked sidewalk, gripping his duffel bag with slightly trembling hands, the weight of the day pressed heavily on his shoulders. Earl wasn't one to dwell on anger. His years of military service had taught him discipline, how to focus on what truly mattered. But as he replayed the interaction with Officer Crawley in his mind, he couldn't shake the condescension, the smirk, the cruel intent behind the man's actions. This wasn't just about the spilled contents of his bag or the words exchanged, it was about something deeper, something systemic. Earl had faced his fair share of prejudice, but this time, it felt like a line had been crossed. It wasn't just humiliation, it was an assault on his dignity. That evening, Earl sat in his modest apartment, the duffel bag now neatly packed again and sitting by the door. The room was small but clean, adorned with a few mementos from his past, a framed photo of his unit during his time in the army, a worn American flag folded in a triangle on a shelf, and a collection of medals carefully displayed in a glass case. They were reminders of who he had been, of the battles he had fought, not just overseas, but here, at home. As he stared at the photo, his mind wandered to the countless times he had put his life on the line for a country that didn't always seem to value him in return. The next day, Earl decided to take action, not in anger but in purpose. He made his way to the local community center, a place where he often volunteered to help veterans navigate the complexities of civilian life. There, he met Angela Torres, a passionate lawyer who had dedicated her career to fighting injustices. Angela had sharp eyes that seemed to see through people, and when Earl walked into her office, she immediately sensed the weight he carried. Earl recounted the incident at the bus stop, his voice steady but filled with a quiet resolve. Angela listened intently, her pen scratching across a notepad as she jotted down details. When he finished, she leaned back in her chair, her expression thoughtful. "Earl, this isn't just about what happened to you. This is about a pattern, a system that allows people like that officer to abuse their power. If we're going to do something about it, we need to be strategic." Earl nodded, his gaze unwavering. "I'm not looking for revenge. I just want accountability. People like him shouldn't get away with treating others like that." Angela tapped her pen against the desk, her mind clearly working through a plan. "Do you remember seeing anyone recording the incident? Videos can be powerful evidence, especially if we're going to expose this publicly." Earl thought back to the crowd at the bus stop. He hadn't paid much attention at the time, but now he recalled glimpses of people holding up their phones, their faces a mix of shock and hesitation. "There were a few people filming," he said slowly. "I didn't think much of it then." Angela's eyes lit up. "If we can find those videos, we'll have a strong foundation. But we'll also need to dig deeper into this officer's history. People like him rarely act out of character, it's likely he's done this before." The next few days were a whirlwind of activity. Angela worked tirelessly, reaching out to witnesses and gathering evidence, while Earl provided whatever details he could remember. Each piece of information painted a clearer picture of Officer Crawley, a man who had used his badge not to protect and serve, but to intimidate and control. As they uncovered more, Earl began to feel a sense of purpose that he hadn't felt in years. This wasn't just about him anymore, it was about standing up for others who had been silenced. But not everyone was supportive. Earl's friend, Jimmy Carter, a fellow veteran who often shared coffee with him at the local diner, expressed concern. "Earl, are you sure about this?" Jimmy asked one morning, his brow furrowed with worry. "Going up against a cop, it's not gonna be easy. They close ranks, you know that." Earl sipped his coffee, his expression calm but resolute. "Jimmy, I've faced worse. This isn't about me anymore. It's about doing what's right." Jimmy sighed, leaning back in his chair. "Just be careful. They don't play fair." As Earl and Angela continued their work, the tension in the air grew. Earl couldn't shake the feeling that Officer Crawley might retaliate if he caught wind of their efforts. And sure enough, one evening as Earl walked home from the community center, he noticed a familiar police cruiser parked across the street from his building. Crawley was sitting inside, his gaze fixed on Earl with a smirk that sent a chill down his spine. It was a silent message, a warning that he wasn't untouchable. Earl didn't let it deter him. Instead, it fueled his determination. He reached out to his network of fellow veterans, many of whom had faced similar struggles. Their stories added to the growing narrative of abuse and injustice, creating a powerful case that Angela began to piece together. Every late-night conversation, every document uncovered, brought them closer to the truth. Earl's quiet resilience became a rallying point, inspiring others to step forward and share their experiences. As the evidence mounted, Angela prepared to take their case to the media. "This is the kind of story that can't be ignored," she told Earl one evening, her eyes alight with conviction. "But we have to be ready for the backlash. Once this goes public, they'll come after you." Earl met her gaze, his voice steady. "Let them. I'm not afraid." The day finally came when Angela submitted their findings to a local journalist, a young man named Marcus Hill, who had a reputation for exposing corruption. Marcus was captivated by Earl's story, not just because of the injustice he had faced, but because of the strength he exuded in the face of it. The article was published the following week, accompanied by video footage of the incident at the bus stop. The city was stunned. But as Earl braced himself for what was to come, he couldn't shake the feeling that the battle was far from over. Officer Crawley was not the type to go down without a fight, and Earl knew that the true reckoning was still ahead. The stage was set, the tension crackling in the air like a storm on the horizon. All that remained was to see how it would unfold, and Earl was ready. The air was heavy with tension as Earl walked toward the courthouse. The article exposing Officer Crawley's actions had sent shockwaves through the city, and the public outcry had been swift and unrelenting. People had gathered outside the courthouse, their signs and chants filling the streets with a sense of shared anger and purpose. Earl wasn't used to this kind of attention, but he walked through the crowd with quiet determination, his shoulders squared, his steps measured. He knew why he was here, and he wasn't going to let fear or doubt cloud his resolve. Inside, the courthouse buzzed with activity. Earl spotted Angela near the front of the room, her face calm but focused as she reviewed her notes. She looked up and gave him a small nod, a silent reassurance that they were ready for whatever was about to unfold. Earl took his seat, feeling the weight of every eye in the room on him. He wasn't just here for himself, he was here for every person who had been silenced, dismissed, or mistreated. The doors at the back of the courtroom swung open, and Officer Crawley entered, flanked by his attorney. His confidence was unshaken, his smirk firmly in place as he scanned the room. His eyes landed on Earl, and for a moment, his expression flickered, something between annoyance and unease, but it was gone as quickly as it appeared. Crawley's lawyer whispered something to him, and they made their way to their table, the officer sitting with a posture that radiated arrogance. As the proceedings began, the room fell silent. Angela's opening statement was concise but powerful, painting a clear picture of Crawley's pattern of abuse and the systemic failures that had allowed him to operate unchecked. She spoke with a precision that left no room for doubt, her words slicing through the air like a blade. Earl watched her, feeling a swell of gratitude for her unwavering dedication to the case. Crawley's lawyer responded with a defense that was as dismissive as it was condescending, painting Earl as an overzealous old man who had misinterpreted a routine police interaction. The insinuation hung in the air, and Earl felt his hands tighten into fists under the table. He forced himself to stay calm, reminding himself that this wasn't the time to lose control. Angela would handle it. When it was Earl's turn to testify, the room seemed to hold its breath. He rose slowly, his movements deliberate, and walked to the stand. As he took his seat, he felt the weight of the moment settle over him. This was his chance to speak, to be heard, and he wasn't going to waste it. Angela approached him, her voice steady as she began her questioning. "Mr. Patterson," she said, her tone warm but firm, "can you tell us, in your own words, what happened that day at the bus stop?" Earl nodded, his voice calm but filled with conviction as he recounted the events. He spoke of the humiliation, the condescension, the moment Crawley had stepped on his belongings and looked at him like he was less than human. His words painted a vivid picture, and the room seemed to hang on every syllable. When he finished, there was a moment of silence before Angela continued. "Mr. Patterson, could you also tell the court about your background, your service to this country?" Earl hesitated for a moment, then began to speak. He talked about his time in the army, the years he had spent overseas, the sacrifices he had made. His voice didn't waver, but there was an unmistakable emotion in his words, a mix of pride and pain that resonated deeply. As he spoke, he noticed Crawley shifting uncomfortably in his seat, his smirk replaced by a tight-lipped expression. When Crawley took the stand, the atmosphere in the room shifted. His arrogance was palpable, his tone dismissive as he answered the questions directed at him. He denied any wrongdoing, brushing off the incident as a misunderstanding blown out of proportion. But as Angela cross-examined him, her questions became sharper, more precise, chipping away at his composure. "Officer Crawley," she said, her voice cutting through the room, can you explain why multiple witnesses reported seeing you kick Mr. Patterson's belongings and make demeaning comments toward him? Crawley hesitated, his confidence faltering for the first time. I don't recall making any demeaning comments, he said, his voice strained. Angela didn't let up. So you're saying all these witnesses, independent of each other, fabricated their accounts? I'm saying they might have misunderstood the situation, Crawley replied, his tone defensive. Angela took a step closer, her gaze piercing. And what about the video footage, Officer Crawley? Did the cameras also misunderstand the situation? The room fell silent as a screen at the front of the courtroom flickered to life. The footage from the bus stop played, showing Crawley's actions in stark detail. His smirk, his words, the kick, all of it was there, undeniable and damning. A murmur rippled through the courtroom as the weight of the evidence settled over everyone present. Crawley's face turned pale, his bravado crumbling under the scrutiny. He looked toward his lawyer, but the man's expression was one of thinly veiled frustration. Crawley's gaze shifted to Earl, and for the first time, there was no arrogance in his eyes, only a flicker of fear. Angela turned to the jury, her voice steady but filled with purpose. This is not just about one man's actions. This is about a system that allows abuse of power to go unchecked, that allows individuals like Officer Crawley to operate without accountability. But today, we have the chance to send a message, that this kind of behavior will not be tolerated. As the jury began their deliberations, Earl sat quietly, his hands folded in his lap. He felt a sense of calm, a certainty that he had done everything he could. Crawley, on the other hand, was a shadow of his former self, his confidence shattered. The once proud officer now sat slumped in his chair, his eyes darting nervously around the room. The wait for the verdict was tense, the minutes stretching into what felt like hours. But when the jury returned, their decision was clear. Crawley was found guilty of misconduct and abuse of power, his actions condemned in no uncertain terms. The room erupted in a mix of applause and murmurs, the weight of justice finally lifting the tension that had hung in the air. Earl didn't smile, didn't celebrate. He simply rose from his seat, his movements deliberate, and walked toward the exit. As he stepped outside, the crowd that had gathered greeted him with cheers and applause, their voices a chorus of support. Earl paused for a moment, taking it all in, before continuing down the steps. He didn't need to look back to know that he had made a difference, that his fight had not been in vain. As the crowd outside the courthouse began to disperse, Earl lingered near the steps, his mind swirling with emotions that felt as heavy as the summer air. He had stood his ground, exposed the truth, and seen justice served, yet the weight of the day lingered on his shoulders. The cheers from the crowd, while affirming, didn't erase the scars of what had brought him here. Earl was never one to seek applause, his fight had always been for dignity, not validation. Angela approached him, her face a mix of relief and triumph, but also exhaustion. She placed a hand on his shoulder, her grip firm yet comforting. "You did it, Earl," she said, her voice steady but tinged with emotion. "You stood up to him. You didn't let him silence you." Earl nodded, his eyes fixed on the horizon as if searching for something that remained just out of reach. "It wasn't just for me," he said after a moment, his voice quiet but resolute. "It was for everyone who's been in my shoes. For the ones who didn't get the chance to speak." Angela studied him, her admiration evident. "And because of you, they'll have a chance now. This isn't just about Crawley anymore. It's about change. About accountability." Earl turned to face her, his expression thoughtful. "Change doesn't come easy, Angela. People like him, they don't go down quietly. You know he'll try to fight this, try to twist it into something it's not." Angela's jaw tightened, her determination as unyielding as ever. "Let him try. He can fight all he wants, but the truth is out there now. He can't escape that." Before either of them could say more, a voice called out from nearby. It was Marcus Hill, the journalist who had broken the story wide open. He jogged up to them, his notepad in hand and a curious expression on his face. "Earl, Angela," he began, slightly out of breath, "can I get a quick word? The public is going to want to know how you feel about the verdict." Earl hesitated, glancing at Angela, who gave him an encouraging nod. "Go ahead," she said softly. "This is your moment." Earl turned to Marcus, his expression unreadable. "I'm not sure what there is to say," he began, his voice calm but measured. "What happened today wasn't about me. It was about standing up to a system that allows people like Crawley to abuse their power. It was about sending a message that no one is above accountability." Marcus scribbled furiously, hanging on Earl's every word. "And how do you feel now that it's over? Knowing that you've set a precedent, that you've made a difference?" Earl's gaze softened, his eyes reflecting the weariness of a man who had fought too many battles to celebrate one victory too soon. "It's not over," he said simply. "This was one step. There's still a long road ahead." Before Marcus could ask another question, Earl turned away, his words lingering in the air like the echo of a distant bell. He wasn't looking for recognition or fame, he was simply a man who had done what needed to be done. As Earl made his way home that evening, the streets felt quieter than usual, the city's noise dulled by the gravity of the day. He walked with his head high, his footsteps steady, but there was no denying the fatigue that tugged at his body. His mind replayed the moments in the courtroom, the look on Crawley's face as the verdict was read, the murmurs of the crowd as the truth came to light. He had won, yes, but the victory felt bittersweet, a reminder of the battles that still lay ahead. When Earl finally reached his apartment, he found a message waiting for him on his answering machine. The robotic voice announced a missed call, followed by the unmistakable voice of Crawley, his tone dripping with anger and defiance. "You think this is over, old man?" Crawley spat, his words crackling through the speaker. "You don't know who you're dealing with. You've made a mistake, and you're gonna regret it." Earl stood frozen for a moment, the weight of Crawley's words settling over him like a dark cloud. He had anticipated retaliation, but hearing it spoken aloud was different. It was a reminder that the fight wasn't just in the courtroom, it was everywhere, in every system, in every corner of a society that had allowed men like Crawley to thrive. Later that night, Angela called to check on him. Earl relayed the message, his voice calm but firm. Angela's response was immediate, her tone sharp with concern. "Earl, this isn't something to take lightly. We need to report this. Threatening you like that, it's not just unethical, it's illegal." Earl sighed, his weariness evident. "I expected as much, Angela. Men like him, they don't take losing well. But I'm not afraid. I've faced worse." Angela's voice softened, her admiration clear. "I know you have, Earl. But that doesn't mean you have to face this alone. We'll handle it, together." The next morning, Earl woke to find his story splashed across every major news outlet. The footage from the courthouse, combined with Marcus's detailed reporting, had captured the attention of the nation. People from all walks of life reached out, offering their support, their gratitude, their own stories of struggle. Earl read each message carefully, feeling a renewed sense of purpose with every word. But as the days went on, the tension began to build. Crawley's supporters, emboldened by their anger, began to push back, spreading misinformation and attempting to discredit Earl's character. The fight had moved from the courtroom to the court of public opinion, and Earl found himself at the center of a storm he hadn't anticipated. Angela, ever the strategist, worked tirelessly to counter the attacks, rallying support and ensuring that the truth remained at the forefront. Earl, for his part, remained steadfast, his resolve unshaken by the noise around him. He had faced battles far greater than this, and he knew that the only way to win was to stand firm. One evening, as Earl sat in his apartment, a knock came at the door. He opened it to find a young man standing there, his face anxious but determined. The man introduced himself as one of Crawley's former colleagues, someone who had seen the officer's actions firsthand but had been too afraid to speak out. "I saw what he did to you," the man said, his voice trembling slightly. "And I've seen what he's done to others. It's not right. I want to help." Earl listened intently, his gratitude evident. This was what he had fought for, not just for himself, but to inspire others to stand up, to speak out, to demand better. As he shook the man's hand, Earl felt a renewed sense of hope, a reminder that even in the darkest of times, there was always a glimmer of light. As the verdict settled over the city like a storm finally breaking, the consequences rippled outward, touching every corner of the community. Earl Patterson found himself in an unfamiliar position, no longer just a quiet veteran living his life in modest obscurity, but a symbol of resilience and justice. His name was on the lips of strangers, his story shared across news channels and social media. People stopped him on the street, some to thank him, others to question why he hadn't stayed silent. The recognition was unexpected, and at times overwhelming, but Earl wore it with the same quiet dignity that had carried him through every battle in his life. The fallout for Officer Crawley was swift and sharp. He was suspended without pay, and an internal investigation was launched into his history on the force. As more people came forward, detailing encounters where Crawley had used his badge as a weapon, the narrative began to shift. What had once been a story of one man's abuse of power now became an indictment of a larger system that had enabled him. Earl watched it unfold with a mix of satisfaction and sadness. He hadn't wanted to become the face of this fight, but now that he was here, he knew he couldn't turn away. Angela Torres, relentless as ever, worked tirelessly to ensure the momentum didn't falter. She held press conferences, fielded questions from reporters, and met with community leaders to push for systemic changes. Earl admired her tenacity, her refusal to let the story fade into the background. She often reminded him that this wasn't just about Crawley, and Earl agreed, though a part of him longed for the simplicity of his life before the bus stop incident. He had become a reluctant warrior in a battle far larger than himself. One evening, Angela invited Earl to a community meeting where people shared their own experiences with injustice. Earl sat quietly as one person after another stood to speak, their voices trembling with emotion as they recounted moments of humiliation, fear, and frustration. A young mother spoke of being stopped and searched in front of her children, her voice breaking as she described the shame in their eyes. An elderly man shared a story eerily similar to Earl's, his hands shaking as he gripped the microphone. Earl listened intently, his heart heavy but his resolve strengthening with each story. He realized that his fight was no longer just his own, it belonged to all of them. As the meeting ended, a group of young activists approached Earl, their faces alight with a mixture of admiration and urgency. They wanted him to speak at a rally they were organizing, to use his platform to inspire others to join the movement. Earl hesitated, the weight of their request settling over him. He had never sought to be a leader, but he couldn't deny the power of his voice now. After a moment, he nodded, his decision met with smiles and gratitude. The rally took place a week later in a park downtown, the crowd spilling onto the streets as people from all walks of life came together. Earl stood on the stage, the microphone in his hand feeling heavier than he'd expected. He looked out at the sea of faces, some familiar, most not, and took a deep breath. His voice, steady but filled with emotion, carried across the crowd as he spoke of justice, accountability, and the need for change. He didn't speak of anger or revenge, but of hope and the belief that a better future was possible if they all stood together. By the time he finished, the crowd erupted in applause, their cheers echoing into the night. But not everyone was moved by the movement. Crawley's supporters, embittered by his downfall, grew louder and more aggressive. They organized their own counter-protests, spreading false narratives about Earl and the events at the bus stop. They claimed he had provoked Crawley, that he had exaggerated the story for attention. Earl tried to ignore the noise, but the lies stung, a reminder of how easily the truth could be distorted. Angela, ever vigilant, worked to counter the misinformation, but the tension in the community continued to rise. One night, as Earl walked home from a meeting with Angela, he noticed a car idling at the corner near his building. The windows were tinted, the engine humming softly in the stillness. Earl's steps slowed, his instincts kicking in as he felt the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. He glanced around, noting the empty street and the faint glow of a street lamp casting long shadows on the pavement. As he approached his building, the car's engine revved, and it sped away, its tires screeching against the asphalt. Earl stood frozen for a moment, his heart pounding as he watched the taillights disappear into the distance. The next morning, a package arrived at Earl's door with no return address. Inside was a single sheet of paper with the words, "Stay quiet," scrawled in bold, uneven letters. Earl stared at it for a long time, his mind racing. The threat was clear, but it only solidified his resolve. He called Angela, who arrived within the hour, her expression a mixture of concern and determination. "We're not letting this intimidate us," she said firmly. "This only proves that what we're doing is working. They're scared." Earl nodded, though the weight of the situation pressed heavily on him. He had always been a man who faced challenges head-on, but this was different. This wasn't a battlefield where the enemy was visible, where the rules were clear. This was a fight in the shadows, where threats came from unseen corners and safety felt like an illusion. Yet, even as doubt crept in, Earl knew he couldn't back down. He had come too far, and too many people were counting on him. In the days that followed, the tension in the city continued to escalate. Protests and counter-protests filled the streets, the divide between the two sides growing deeper. Earl found himself at the center of it all, a symbol of hope to some and a target of scorn to others. But through it all, he remained steadfast, his resolve unshaken by the noise around him. Angela worked to keep him focused, reminding him of the progress they had made. "Change takes time, Earl," she said one evening as they reviewed the latest developments. "But it's happening. You've started something that can't be stopped." Earl nodded, her words a small comfort in the midst of the chaos. He knew the fight wasn't over, that there were still battles to be won. But as he looked out at the city, at the people who had come together to demand something better, he felt a flicker of hope. The road ahead was long, but he was ready to walk it. Earl sat in his small apartment, the familiar hum of the city outside a stark contrast to the turmoil brewing within his mind. The weight of everything that had transpired rested heavily on him. His days were no longer filled with quiet routines and solitary reflections, now, they were consumed by meetings, interviews, and the relentless hum of the city's reaction to the fallout. It wasn't the life he had envisioned for himself in his later years, but as he stared at the wall where his medals hung, he reminded himself why he had stepped into the storm. His fight wasn't over, it might never truly be over, but he knew he couldn't turn back now. The knock at the door startled him. He rose slowly, his joints stiff from the day's efforts, and opened it to find Angela standing there, her expression as serious as he'd ever seen it. She stepped inside without waiting for an invitation, her bag slung over her shoulder and a folder clutched in her hand. Earl raised an eyebrow as he closed the door behind her. "What's this about?" he asked, his voice calm but tinged with curiosity. Angela set the folder on the table, opening it to reveal a series of documents. "We've got a problem, Earl," she said, her tone clipped. "Crawley's legal team is pushing back hard. They're trying to paint you as a troublemaker, someone who's stirring the pot for attention." Earl sat down, his expression steady but his jaw tightening slightly. "I figured they'd try something like that," he said. "What's their angle?" Angela leaned forward, her eyes locking onto his. "They're digging into your past. Military service, personal records, anything they can twist to discredit you. They've already leaked some nonsense about you being difficult to work with during your army days, claiming you had conflicts with superiors. It's all baseless, of course, but they're banking on public perception shifting if they throw enough mud." Earl exhaled slowly, leaning back in his chair. "I've seen this before, Angela. They're trying to make me look like the villain so people forget who the real one is. I can handle it." Angela's lips pressed into a thin line, her frustration evident. "You shouldn't have to handle it. this shouldn't even be happening. You've done nothing but tell the truth, and now you're the one under attack. It's disgusting. Earl reached across the table, placing a reassuring hand on her arm. Angela, I knew what I was walking into when I decided to speak out. I'm not surprised by their tactics, and you shouldn't be either. This isn't about fairness, it's about power. And they're scared of losing it. Angela shook her head, her resolve unshaken but her anger simmering beneath the surface. Then we fight back, she said firmly. We counter every lie, every smear, with the truth. They're not going to get away with this. The next few days were a whirlwind of activity. Angela and her team worked tirelessly to gather character witnesses, testimonials from Earl's fellow veterans, and records that painted a clear picture of his integrity and service. Earl, for his part, remained composed, refusing to let the attacks shake him. But the tension was palpable, the constant scrutiny and pressure taking its toll. One evening, as Earl walked home from a meeting with Angela, he noticed a man leaning against a lamppost near his building. The man was dressed casually, but something about his stance and the way he watched Earl set off alarm bells in his mind. Earl's pace slowed, his instincts honed from years of military training kicking in. As he approached, the man straightened and stepped into his path. Earl Patterson, the man said, his voice low and steady. You've been making a lot of noise lately. Earl met his gaze, his expression calm but his muscles tensing. If you've got something to say, say it. The man smirked, his eyes glinting with something that felt like a challenge. Just thought you should know, not everyone's happy about what you're doing. You might want to think twice before you keep pushing. Earl didn't flinch. If that's supposed to scare me, you're wasting your breath. I've faced worse than you, and I'm still standing. The man's smirk faded, replaced by a hard stare. Suit yourself, he said before turning and disappearing into the shadows. Earl stood there for a moment, his heart pounding but his resolve unshaken. He knew the fight was far from over, but encounters like this only strengthened his determination. He had faced men like this before, bullies who used intimidation to maintain their grip on power. But Earl wasn't afraid of them. He never had been. The following day, Angela confronted Earl about the encounter after hearing about it from one of his neighbors. Her frustration was evident as she paced back and forth in her office. This is exactly what I was worried about, she said, her voice tight with concern. They're trying to rattle you, to make you back down. Earl remained seated, his expression calm. And they're failing. Angela, I'm not backing down. Not now, not ever. Angela stopped pacing, her hands on her hips as she looked at him. I know you're strong, Earl. But you don't have to do this alone. We're in this together, and we're not going to let them win. As the days turned into weeks, the tension in the city continued to rise. Protests and counter-protests filled the streets, the divide between the two sides growing deeper. Earl found himself at the center of it all, a reluctant symbol of a fight that was bigger than him. He spoke at rallies, gave interviews, and continued to stand firm in the face of mounting pressure. Through it all, he remained steady, his resolve unshaken. But the fight was taking its toll. Earl's nights were restless, his mind racing with thoughts of what lay ahead. He often found himself staring at the medals on his wall, reminders of battles fought and won, and wondering if this fight would ever truly end. Yet, even in his moments of doubt, he knew he couldn't give up. Too much was at stake, not just for him, but for everyone who had been silenced, dismissed, or mistreated. One evening, as Earl sat on his small balcony, the city lights stretching out before him, Angela called with an update. Her voice was filled with a mixture of exhaustion and hope. Earl, we've got a break. One of Crawley's former colleagues has come forward. He's willing to testify about the corruption and abuse he witnessed on the force. Earl's grip on the phone tightened. That's good news, he said, his voice steady but tinged with cautious optimism. But it's not the end. No, Angela agreed. But it's a step. And we'll take every step we can get. As Earl hung up the phone, he felt a flicker of hope. The fight was far from over, but for the first time, he could see a path forward, a chance to not just hold Crawley accountable, but to challenge the system that had allowed him to thrive. Earl knew the road ahead would be long and difficult, but he was ready. He had always been ready. Earl sat quietly at the edge of the courthouse steps, watching the city come alive in the early evening light. The courthouse, now familiar territory, had become a strange symbol of his new reality. The buzz of the day's hearing still echoed in his mind, a mixture of tense exchanges and the steady unveiling of truths that no one could ignore. Angela sat beside him, her briefcase resting at her feet, her phone buzzing intermittently with updates from her team. She glanced at Earl, her expression softening. "You've been awfully quiet," she said, her voice breaking the hum of the street noise. "What's going through your mind?" Earl didn't respond immediately. His gaze remained fixed on the horizon, where the fading sunlight cast long shadows against the buildings. Finally, he exhaled deeply and turned to her. "I've been thinking about how far we've come. And how much further we still have to go. It feels like a never-ending fight, Angela. Every step forward feels like there's another wall waiting to block the way." Angela nodded, her eyes filled with understanding. "That's how these battles are, Earl. Change doesn't come quickly, and it doesn't come easily. But you're making a difference. You've already shaken a system that's been untouched for too long." Earl leaned back slightly, letting the cool air wash over him. "Sometimes I wonder if it's enough. If what we're doing now will really lead to something lasting. Or if it'll just fade away once the headlines move on." Angela's expression hardened slightly, her determination evident. "It won't fade. Not as long as people like you keep pushing. This isn't just a headline, Earl. It's a movement. And movements don't die as long as there's someone to carry the torch." Earl gave her a faint smile, appreciating her unwavering faith even as doubt lingered in his own heart. Before he could respond, Angela's phone buzzed again. She picked it up, her expression shifting as she read the message. "It's from Marcus," she said, her voice laced with urgency. "The former officer who agreed to testify. He's getting cold feet. Says he's afraid of retaliation." Earl's jaw tightened, his thoughts immediately racing to the man's predicament. That's exactly what Crawley and his kind count on. Fear. It's how they keep people in line. Angela stood, pacing slightly as she formulated her response. "We need his testimony, Earl. Without it, Crawley's defense will poke holes in the case. They'll claim this is all hearsay, exaggeration. We can't afford to lose him." Earl stood as well, his expression resolute. "Then let me talk to him. Maybe hearing from someone who's been in the fire will help him see that it's worth standing up." Angela hesitated for a moment, then nodded. "All right. I'll arrange a meeting. But Earl, be careful. He's scared, and he has every right to be. Don't push too hard." The meeting was set for the following evening at a small diner on the outskirts of the city. Earl arrived early, taking a seat at a booth near the back where the noise of clinking dishes and murmured conversations created a bubble of privacy. He ordered coffee, letting the warmth of the cup steady his nerves as he waited. When the former officer, a young man named Keith, finally arrived, he looked every bit as nervous as Earl had expected. His eyes darted around the room, his shoulders hunched as if he were bracing for an attack. Earl stood to greet him, extending a hand. Keith hesitated before shaking it, his grip weak but steady. "Thanks for coming," Earl said, his voice calm and steady. "I know this isn't easy." Keith slid into the booth, his hands fidgeting with the edge of the menu. "I don't know why I agreed to this," he muttered. "This whole thing feels like a mistake." Earl sat across from him, his gaze steady. "I understand how you feel. When you're up against something as big as this, it's easy to feel like you're better off staying quiet. But silence doesn't fix anything, Keith. It only lets the problem get worse. Keith looked up, his eyes filled with uncertainty. You don't get it. These people, they don't play fair. They'll come after me, my family. I've seen what happens to people who try to speak out. Earl leaned forward, his voice soft but firm. You're right, I don't know your exact situation. But I do know what it feels like to stand in the crosshairs. I know what it's like to be afraid. But I also know what it feels like to speak up and finally be heard. To know that you're doing the right thing, even when it's hard. Keith was silent for a moment, his hands still fidgeting. But what if it's not enough? What if they bury the truth anyway? Earl's gaze didn't waver. Then we dig it up again. And again. Until they can't ignore it anymore. Keith, this fight isn't just about you or me. It's about everyone who's been hurt by people like Crawley. If we don't stand up now, when will we? Keith exhaled shakily, his shoulders slumping slightly. I don't know if I'm as strong as you, Earl. Earl's voice softened further, his tone almost fatherly. Strength isn't about not being afraid. It's about doing what's right, even when you are. You've already shown courage by coming this far. Don't stop now. Keith looked down at his hands, his expression thoughtful. After a long pause, he finally nodded. All right. I'll do it. I'll testify. Relief washed over Earl, but he didn't let it show. He simply nodded, his respect for the young man clear. You're doing the right thing, Keith. And you're not alone in this. The testimony was scheduled for later that week, and as the day approached, the tension in the city seemed to reach a fever pitch. Earl could feel the weight of it everywhere he went, in the guarded looks of his neighbors, in the whispered conversations at the community center. But he also felt the spark of hope, the sense that change was within reach if they could just hold on a little longer. The courtroom was packed on the day of Keith's testimony, the air thick with anticipation. Earl sat beside Angela, his posture steady but his hands gripping the edge of the table. When Keith took the stand, the room fell silent. His voice was shaky at first, but as he recounted the corruption and abuse he had witnessed, his confidence grew. His words painted a damning picture of Crawley and the system that had protected him, and by the time he finished, there was no doubt left in anyone's mind about the truth. As the hearing adjourned, Earl felt a surge of hope unlike anything he'd experienced since the fight began. They had come so far, and though the road ahead was still uncertain, he knew they were closer than ever to the justice they sought. Keith approached him as the crowd dispersed, his expression a mix of relief and gratitude. Thank you, Keith said, his voice filled with sincerity. I don't think I could have done this without you. Earl shook his hand firmly, his own gratitude evident. You did the hard part, Keith. You stood up. And because of that, things are going to change. As Earl walked out of the courthouse that day, the sun breaking through the clouds above, he allowed himself a rare moment of pride. The fight wasn't over, but for the first time, he felt like victory was within reach. And he was ready for whatever came next. The courtroom was quiet as the judge read the final decision. Earl sat motionless, his hands resting on his lap, his posture as straight as the man he had been throughout this entire ordeal. His face betrayed no emotion, but inside, a storm of relief, anticipation, and vindication swirled. The judge's words echoed through the chamber. Officer Daniel Crawley was officially found guilty of misconduct, abuse of power, and obstruction of justice. The sentence handed down was not just a punishment for his actions but a resounding message to those who operated like him under the guise of authority. The room erupted in murmurs as the judge's gavel came down, signaling the end of the trial. Earl turned slightly to glance at Angela, who gave him a triumphant smile. She had fought tooth and nail to see this through, and now, standing in the glow of justice served, her exhaustion seemed to melt into pride. Crawley, on the other hand, sat with a stunned expression, his once confident demeanor shattered. His lawyer leaned over, whispering hurriedly, but Crawley barely moved. He looked up only briefly, his eyes locking with Earl's. There was no anger left in his gaze, only the hollow realization of his defeat. Outside the courthouse, a crowd of supporters waited, their signs held high, their chants echoing through the city streets. Earl walked down the steps with Angela by his side, the two of them greeted with cheers and applause. For a man who had spent most of his life trying to stay invisible, the attention felt almost surreal. Yet, as he raised a hand to acknowledge the crowd, Earl felt something shift within him. This wasn't about him, it never had been. This was about a community, a movement, and a long overdue reckoning. Later that evening, Earl found himself back at the community center, sitting in a circle of chairs surrounded by familiar faces. The space felt warmer than usual, the hum of conversation carrying a sense of hope that hadn't been there before. Keith was there too, sitting across from Earl. The young man looked lighter, as though a weight had been lifted from his shoulders. When the room quieted, Keith spoke up, his voice steady and filled with gratitude. "I didn't think I'd have the courage to do what I did," he said, his eyes meeting Earl's. "But seeing you stand up, seeing what you've done, it gave me the strength I didn't know I had." "Thank you." Earl nodded, his face softening. "You didn't need me to find that strength, Keith. It was always in you. You just needed to trust it." The room fell silent for a moment, the weight of those words settling over everyone. Then Angela stood, her voice carrying the determination that had fueled her throughout this fight. "This isn't the end," she said, her gaze sweeping across the room. "What we've accomplished here is important, but it's just the beginning. There are still so many Crawleys out there, still so much work to do. And we can't let this momentum fade." Earl watched as the group nodded in agreement, their resolve palpable. He felt a swell of pride, not for himself, but for the people who had come together to demand something better. As the meeting ended and people began to leave, Angela approached him, her expression softer now. "You've inspired so many people, Earl," she said. "Including me. I don't know if you realize just how much of a difference you've made." Earl looked at her, a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "I didn't set out to make a difference, Angela. I just wanted to stand up for what was right. But if that's what this has become, then I'm glad." That night, Earl sat on his balcony, the city lights stretching out before him. He felt a sense of peace he hadn't known in years, a quiet satisfaction that came not from victory, but from knowing he had done his part. His phone buzzed on the table beside him, a notification lighting up the screen. It was an article featuring his story, accompanied by a photo of him leaving the courthouse earlier that day. Earl picked up the phone and read the headline, "A Veteran's Fight for Justice Sparks Nationwide Reform." He set the phone down with a quiet chuckle, shaking his head. He didn't need headlines or recognition. What mattered was the change he could see beginning to take root. In the days that followed, the city began to heal. Crawley's sentencing sent shockwaves through the police department, leading to internal reviews and the dismissal of several officers with histories of misconduct. Policies were rewritten, training programs revamped, and community oversight boards established. It wasn't perfect, and it wouldn't fix everything, but it was a start. Earl saw the impact every time he walked through his neighborhood, the cautious optimism in the faces of his neighbors, the sense that perhaps things could finally get better. Earl's life slowly returned to a semblance of normalcy, though he remained a quiet figure of inspiration for those who had followed his journey. He continued to visit the community center, mentoring young people and sharing his story when asked. Angela went on to lead several successful cases, her reputation as a champion for justice growing with each victory. Keith, too, found his footing, joining efforts to reform law enforcement practices and speaking openly about his own experiences. One evening, as Earl sat with Angela and Keith at a small diner, Keith looked across the table, his expression thoughtful. "Do you ever regret it?" he asked. "Speaking out, putting yourself in the spotlight?" Earl shook his head, his gaze steady. "No. I don't regret it. It wasn't easy, and it cost me a lot. But it was worth it. Because now, maybe the next person who finds themselves in my shoes won't feel like they have to stand alone. The reflection of Earl's journey lingers long after the story ends. His fight wasn't just about justice, it was about courage, resilience, and the power of one voice to inspire many. It's a reminder that standing up for what's right, even in the face of immense opposition, can lead to change far greater than we imagine. Now, let me ask you, the listener, what would you do in Earl's place? Would you have the courage to stand up, even when the odds seem insurmountable? Earl's story isn't just his, it's ours, a reflection of the struggles we face as a society and the choices we must make to build a better future. Share your thoughts in the comments below. What part of Earl's journey resonated most with you? How do you think we can all contribute to creating a world where justice prevails? Thank you for being here, for listening, and for taking this journey with us. If you found Earl's story as powerful and inspiring as we did, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to Tales of Twist, and turn on notifications so you never miss another story. Together, let's keep the conversation going. Until next time, take care and stay strong.